Hi, folks. It's Friday Night Photoshop. I'm Mike Leonard. Tonight we're going to be talking about some shortcuts and time savers to make you work more efficiently in Photoshop. So let's dive right in and see what we can figure out. If you go to www.phototourismbymike.com and click on the Education tab, and then go click on Friday Night Photoshop, you'll see that at the bottom of this little list are some notes for FNPS, or Friday Night Photoshop. So if you choose this, you'll see here some notes for Camera Raw and stuff like this. Well, here's one for Photoshop Shortcuts. It's a PDF file. If you go download this and print this, it's a single page document, and I'll be covering pretty much everything on that sheet of paper tonight. Okay, so let's get started. On the sheet of paper, I have the shortcuts broken into how many button clicks that you have to go to. And the first one I'm going to start with doesn't even include a button click. And that is what we simply know as a scrubby. So let's just put some text out here for a moment, and let me show you how scrubbies can work. First of all, that's a little big, but I'm just going to say L-I-G-H-T-H-O-U-S-E, lighthouse. Now, that's too big, and I'd like to put this somewhere up here in the corner. So if I just wipe over this whole text, and if I come up here with my cursor to this point where I get to click on the text icon, you'll see that my cursor goes to this little hand with little arrows on either side. That is a scrubby. So if I click and hold my mouse, left click and hold, and move my mouse left or right, you see I can change the size of the font. And what this is doing is it's changing this number in here. Now I'm just going to move this over and put it here. And maybe I'd like this to be a little bigger. So I'll just click on this scrubby, take the scrubby and just move this up. And maybe that's where I'd like to have it. And I'll just say, okay. And now I've just sized that. Who knew that I needed a 53 point text to make that fit that area? Now, if I didn't do it that way, I would have to have used this pull down, and there are some preset sizes in here. But rarely do these ever conform to the size that you ever really want. So this is why I like using scrubbies. Now, the other place that you can use the scrubbies is in layers, because now I've got this layer here, text layer with lighthouse written in there. But watch this. If I come up here to opacity, I see another scrubby. And if I click and hold, if I move this back, look at what's happening. It's becoming translucent all the way down to being transparent. So I can use this like a watermark, or I could make this just light, just subliminally put the word lighthouse in there. Now, I mentioned watermarks because you could, if you wanted to, actually put in a watermark like I've done here down in the corner, and look at this. If I bring this all the way up, there's the watermark down the corner. But I like to do my watermarks a little more subtly. So I'm just going to pull this back just to make it so you see it's there, but to me it doesn't really take away from the scene. Of course, the word lighthouse does that. So what I'm going to do is I'll just take that away for a moment. And you can see, again, scrubbies to make that translucent, to make that look like it's stain. And that's at 33%. Now, once again, I could come up here and I could move this little bar back and forth to change that, or I could actually go and type in a value here. If I wanted to have 50%, I could just type in a 50. But I like to look at it as being more of a creative function where I physically look at this and then come up here to opacity where I get the scrubby, left click and hold, and just move this back and forth until I'm looking at the watermark until I get it to right about there. That's where I like it. And that time it was 41%. So scrubbies are your friend, and you will find that scrubbies appear in lots of different places. And again, to enable those, all you have to do is move your cursor and wait for that hand to come with the two arrows, and then push and hold the left click on your mouse and slide your mouse left and right, and you'll find it populating the value of whatever the item is that you're looking to adjust. So there's my first shortcut, and that would be Scrubbies. The next one I'd like to talk about are some one-button shortcuts. These are things that you can do with a single button, and that's it. So let's say if I were to want to paint on this scene, and I first need to go to the layer where there is something there to paint on, and you'll see that I've got this brush that's kind of small. And if I were to paint here, you'll see I'm just drawing a little line here, and that's all nice and well and fine. And by the way, Control Z, that's a 2-button shortcut, returns that. But what if I wanted the brush to be bigger? Well, I could move my brush off the screen and go up and change the size of the brush and the hardness and everything right up here. But wouldn't it be nicer if I could keep the brush lined up where I wanted it to be anyhow? And if I use the bracket keys, this is what the bracket close does. If I just keep tapping it, you see the brush is going bigger. If I do the bracket opening, this is the key next to the letter P on the keyboard. It makes it smaller. So there's a real quick shortcut to make your brushes bigger or smaller. This, by the way, works with some other tools. For instance, the Dodge and Burn tool. You can make it larger or smaller using the same bracket keys. So there's some one-button shortcuts. Here's one more one-button shortcut that you won't see on this list, and that's the letter F. Now, if I wanted to show this screen minus some of the clutter, if you will, that's around this, like the toolbar on one side, and I've got layers up in the corner, you don't want to be in the type tool to do this. But watch what happens if I type the letter F once. I just got rid of some of the stuff around the screen. If I type it again, it cleans off everything. So now I'm just looking at the image. Now if I tap it a third time, this brings back the toolbar and everything else that's around the screen. So the letter F is like a three-way toggle. So once again, here is the image with the toolbar. If I hit F again, it cleans up some. If I hit F a third time, there's a quick way just to show somebody without having the clutter on the screen. And I hit F again, and it brings me right back. So that's a one-button shortcut. By the way, if you are going to be painting, and you should notice that you don't see the size of your brush, it could be because your caps lock key is turned on. Yeah, trust me, this one took me about 4 hours to figure out one day. So if you're trying to figure out, well, why is this brush this big, but I'm not seeing it? Hit your caps lock, and now you'll see it. So that's the tip there, if you will. Now let's go to some more single button keys. Sometimes you want the default setting for your color picker. Here we've got the foreground color, here we've got the background color. Well, the default is to have black and white. The quickest way to reset that, instead of having to come over here and click on the color picker and then try and figure out where black is to literally go and just hit the D key. And what that's going to do is it's going to reset the foreground to black and the background to white. So by hitting the D or default key, that resets your color pickers to black and white. Now, a quick way to swap those or to exchange them is to use the letter X. If I hit X, you'll notice what was black is now white, what was white is now black. That can be really useful if you're working on a layer mask, where you might be painting something in black, and if you've gone too far and you need to go repaint in white, I can just keep my finger on the X key, and I can swap back and forth very quickly to make a mask be just the way you want. By the way, when you are working with layers, the F7 key, function 7, can be really useful for bringing out layers. Now, if you don't have layers, this will just bring out showing that you've got a background. But in this case, I've got several layers on this particular image, and to eliminate seeing the layers on the screen without literally getting rid of the layers, all I have to do is hit the F7 key and the layers panel just goes away. Now, in typical Photoshop fashion, there's several ways to get to layers. You could go up to Windows and come down and choose Layers. Incidentally, you'll notice that there are these little letters over on the side. These are shortcuts. So for layers, you'll notice it's F7. So I could click on this, or I could just go and hit the F7 key. Those layers go away. So there's another shortcut for you. Now let's go to some 2-button shortcuts. These first two are pretty simple and I think pretty self-explanatory. We're going to be using the Control key, and then we're going to be tapping another key. So Control and plus will zoom in your picture. Control and minus will zoom out. So let's watch how that works. If I hit the Control key and plus, see, it's going bigger. I can zoom in. Control minus makes it go smaller. So that's pretty simple. And that's only for screen size. We're not at all affecting the size of the image when you go to save it or when you go to print. This is just for viewing, that's all. If you hit Control and 0, that's going to make the image as large as it can be based upon the screen and the resolution of your screen and the pixels of your screen that you are currently using. Control 0 will make it as big as it can be without you cropping or losing any around the edge. Now let's talk about one that I find is really useful. Control and B is the color balance menu in Photoshop. Let's see how that works. You know what I'm going to have to do here? I need to flatten this image. So let me just go up to Layer and flatten the image. And I'm just going to do that. Okay. Control B is a handy one to work with. This is the color balance menu in Photoshop. Let's see what that looks like. Here I have the ability to adjust the colors in the shadows, in the midtones, and in the highlights of the image. So if I wanted this sky to be a little bluer, well, that's really the midtones, isn't it? So I'm going to move this up and I've just made that a little bit bluer. Now the lighthouse looks a little bit blue, and that's definitely a highlight. So I'm probably going to add a little bit of yellow to that. Not much, just a little bit. And if I wanted the dark areas to be, let's say, a little bit warmer, well, I could just add a little bit of red to that. And you see, I've just made those reds pop. And I could even add a little bit of yellow if I wanted to. And now we can look at it before and after here. If I just click this preview, here's before, there's after. Again, before and after. And we can preserve the luminosity, or we can choose not to. And that's just going to let the colors dictate what the brightness of the scene is going to be. Sometimes that can be a better way to go. And you can see how I can make the image look a lot colder, or I can make it look a lot warmer. And so this can be a nice way to adjust. And again, having the preview before and after can be really nice. And then we'll simply say OK. And now those adjustments have just been made to that image. We would then have to go and save the image. So for this next shortcut, I've opened an image that has multiple layers. And what I want to talk about now is Control and E. What this does is allow you to merge 2 layers down to just one. Well, in this case, if I click on this top layer, this is where I've got the word Boothbay Harbor, Maine. And then the layer under that, we've got the word Lupin right there. If I wanted to merge this layer and this layer down together, if I select these 2 layers and then do a Control E, it's going to put those 2 layers together to make a single layer. This can be handy when you don't want to affect this background layer because someday you might want to put some other text over it. But in this case, I've just put these two text elements together into a single layer. And to do that, it was a matter of choosing those two layers and then doing a Control E. While I'm here, let me just show you something kind of fun. If I do a Control I, this is to take a positive image and make it negative, including the colors. Watch this, Control I. Now everything that was green is now the opposite of green. Everything that was purple is now the opposite of purple. Isn't it coincidental that now this lupins are looking green, and all the green around them now look magenta? Now if I do Control I again, you see these are just opposite colors. The opposite of green is magenta. The opposite of magenta is naturally green. Now, anything that's gray is not going to have a big difference, but anything that's white will be black. Anything that's black will be white. This can be a really handy adjustment to use if you ever have some black and white negatives that maybe you photograph using your phone, where you hold them up to the screen and you put up some white graphic on the screen and you take a photo of the negatives, bring them into Photoshop, do a Control I, now they're no longer negatives. So that's a real quick way to scan some film just to get an idea for how it's going to look. If you do color film, you could do the same thing, but you're going to have to do some color adjustments because the orange base of regular film will look very blue, and now you'll just have to remove that blue cast. The next one I'd like to talk about is Control J. Control J, think of it as being jumping, and it's a great way to duplicate a layer. So in this case, my background layer is what you see here on the screen. If I do a Control J, I've just made an exact copy of it. Now, this could be a case where maybe we take this exact copy and we affect it, and then we blend it back to the original. So if I were to take the filter and maybe put in a little Gaussian blur, yeah, that's a little too much, isn't it? So I'll bring this down just a little bit to make that look soft, somewhere around there. I like that. Now I'm going to use scrubbies that we've just learned how to use and go up here to opacity and watch what happens when I blend this back by a certain percentage to that background copy that we know is absolutely sharp. There's zero capacity, but if I bring this in just a little bit like this, let's just zoom in on this, and I'm using my mouse wheel to do that. But you can see that I can give this like a glow, almost like an aura, just to soften it just a little bit. And that's what I call that Hallmark card effect, when you want to have something just look kind of soft. And that works really nice to be able to do that. Now I could just go and do the Control E to merge these two together. But in this case, I'll just keep these separate because maybe I don't always want that to be soft. Maybe I do want it to be hard. So that's the Control J to quickly make a copy of a background. Control L, we've talked about, is all about levels. And if I just go bring this up, we can see here's the histogram, and this is where I could make this look a little lighter or a little darker. I think we all know what levels are. Basically, it's the histogram that you see on the back of your camera, and through this, I'm able to go and make a lot of changes to the image. So there, I just lightened it up a little bit. And we can look at the before and after here just by turning on and off that little eyeball. Control M is for curves. And let's go see what that does. Now, when you first bring this up, you might see that it only has 16 squares. If you hold the Alt key and just left click, this will bring up a number more squares. Curves is where we get to adjust the tonality of just certain portions of the image. Here's that histogram that we're all familiar with, but what I can do is I can take just this top part of the curve, and I can move it down. You see how the image is getting darker? And if I move it to the right, see how it's getting lighter? But I'm doing some clipping there, which isn't always a good thing. So if I moved it over here to where this histogram is coming down, kind of falling off there, then what I've just done is I've just gone to the maximum white without clipping anything. But here's one nice thing about this particular level adjustment, and that is by clicking on this little scrubby that's over here, I can come in and click on any part of the image and hold, and see, I'll get a scrubby there. If I move it up, that tonality is going to go brighter. If I go down, it goes darker. So maybe I want that lupin to be a little lighter, but gee, I'd like to have this part of the image be a little bit darker. And you see, I'm able to go in and make specific adjustments based upon the tonality of where my eyedropper is selecting. And that can be really useful. And you could come in here and adjust this curve manually to get the tonality that you might be looking for. And this is just going to take the darker parts of the image and make it darker. And on this side of the curve, I can click and hold. It makes the lighter scenes brighter or darker. Again, something to go and experiment with, but I do use this a fair amount. I like the fact that there's a preview, so we can look at it before and after. And there is this auto function, which can be useful. If I just click on this, you see, this is finding the darkest this can be without clipping, and this is the lightest that can be without clipping. Sometimes it's nice, sometimes it isn't. Maybe this is a case where you do Control J first, do the auto, and then maybe you blend it back. So there are just some things to go and experiment with under curves. And again, to get to curves, it's just a matter of doing a Control and M, the letter M. Now, once you've gotten your image to be just the way you want it to be, now you want to save it. Now, typically, you'd go up to File and you'd choose Save As. Now, there's a shortcut for that, Shift, Control, and S. But if you are content with what you're doing and you know that you would like to take this image and just save it right over whatever file with which you're currently working, you need to know this is destructive because you're not going to be getting it back. That's where it's sometimes a better idea to do a save as or do a save as a copy. And then what you can do is, as you're working on this, occasionally go do a Control S. And what that's going to do is it's going to save the file so that if you should walk away and close this, and maybe you've made these adjustments, well, if you do the Control S, when you come back and reopen this, you will have saved your work. The next shortcut I'd like to talk about is Control T. If I go and select all, this is going to be a Control A to get the marching ants. Now I've just made a selection. I can now do Control T, and you'll notice this puts handles around the image. I can now click on this and I can move and change the size of this image to be bigger or smaller. And if I right click, there's a number of different ways that I can transform this image, including perspective, skew, distort, rotate, scale. Distort's one that we've talked about before, and that's where I can take just a corner and just affect only it. You see what I'm able to do here? I can pull this all around, I can stretch it out, I can really manipulate an image. And this can be useful, particularly if you're trying to get something in the background to be straight. And maybe you have to pull something or push something to make that work. So that's the distort tool that I'm using under the transform tool. One of the last two button keys I'd like to talk about is Control and U. This is for hue and saturation. If I go do a Control U, we've seen this before. This is a quick way to add saturation or to make something black and white. It's not the best way to make a black and white. Again, as we've seen, there's much better ways to do that under channel mixing. But I can quickly adjust the lightness. Maybe if I wanted to make this a pad of paper on which I might want to make note paper, well, that's where I might just move this brightness way up, and now I could print this and put the word notes up here, and you could write over this. It wouldn't be competing your pen strokes with that background. We can also go in and make changes in the colors. And if I use this little scrubby, this even shows you the scrubby, I can come in and click on these purple lupins, and you see I got a scrubby there. I can add or deduct just the saturation for just those. Maybe I'd like this to be a little bit greener. I can do that, or less green. And while I'm there, I can lighten just the greens or darken just the greens. By the way, if I come up here on these lupins, look at that, I can go and change the color of those lupins. And that's affecting just those colors that I'd selected. So that's a little more purple, isn't it, than what we started with. So those are some things that you can work with under hue and saturation. And again, the shortcut to get there is Control and U. So that's about all the 2-button shortcuts. There's a 3-button shortcut that can be useful. And if I were to make a mistake and draw on this errantly like this, I'm just scribbling away. All right. If I don't like that, I could do a Control Z, and this is a 2-button shortcut that just brings me back one step. I mentioned that there was a 3-button shortcut. Depending upon your system, some work with a Control and Z. Others, you have to hit Control, Alt, and Z to do undos. In some of the newer versions of Photoshop, it's just a 2-button click, the Control Z to go back. Now, let me show you one other thing. I'm going to draw some lines in here. I'm going to take my finger off the mouse. Now I'm going to draw some more lines, taking my finger off the mouse. And now I'm going to go draw some more lines, take my finger off the mouse. And now maybe I'll just do like a little circle here and a little circle here. Watch what happens when I do Control and Z. It remembers the last thing I did, and then the thing before that, and then the thing before that, and before that, and before that. Now, if I've gone too far, I could always come up here to Edit and use the Redo brush tool, and that's going to put back the last thing that I did. And if I do Redo brush tool again, it'll bring back the next one. Now, there is a history panel that you could use that would allow you to do this. But again, tonight's all about shortcuts, and I'm just trying to show you some quick ways so that you can undo things to get back to where you started if you need to do that. Did you know that you can make your own shortcut? I've done that. I have to tip images to different color spaces quite frequently. And the way to get to that is to go to Edit and then come down here to Convert to Profile. And once you've done that, this tells you what the color space is that you're starting with. And here's where you get to choose which color space do you want to tip it to. Now, normally I'm tipping things to either sRGB, because I might be sending an image out to Walmart or Walgreens or sending it to somebody, or maybe I might be posting an image up to a website. That's all wants to be sRGB. But if I'm sending something to a publication, well, that's where I might be using this working CMYK. And when I choose that, and when I say OK, you'll notice that here's the source, what the image is right now. This is what it's going to become, and I'll say OK to that. And now look at what happens when I come back to edit and go down to convert to profile. It's starting as this CMYK file. And I could convert it back, but I wouldn't want to do that in this case. You can lose some quality if you bounce back and forth a lot. But the point is, to get to this convert to profile, sometimes I don't want to have to go to edit and then come down here to convert to profile. Instead, what I did was I created my own keyboard shortcut, and I made mine Control and F12. You could do the same thing. Here's how it works. First of all, note where we are. We're under the Edit menu. There's File, and then there's Edit. And then I come down here, and there's Convert to Profile. If I go to Keyboard Shortcuts, remember there was File, but then we need the Edit tab that's up top, and if I open that up, and if I scroll down, you'll see all the things that are under that heading. And I have to go all the way down to where it says Convert to Profile. Now, I've already put in Control and F12. Yours may not have anything in that space. It might look like what is here above. And if I were to click above, see how that's empty? Now, if you just go hit the Control key and then F12, for instance, you can create your own shortcut such that every time you hit Control and F12, it'll take you immediately to this particular setting. And that can be a big time saver if this is something that you have to do frequently. Now, if you happen to assign something that's already been assigned, like Control L, it will tell you, hey, this is already assigned to some other shortcut. Do you want to change that? I would say no, because Control and L has been for levels forever in Photoshop. So you have to find one that's not used. I just lucked out with Control and F12. Unless you have put in some shortcut for that, there's a good chance that Control and F12 are probably available for you. So that's something that you could do if you're having to convert things to profiles for competitions, for sending prints out, for publications, etc. And once you've done that, then you just simply accept it, and now it's committed, and we say OK. Then when I go and hit Control and F12, you see it brings up that box, Convert to Profile. It takes me there directly. And if you look under Edit, you'll see it has even put my shortcut over here as the shortcut. So that's how you can make your own shortcut for a function that you might be using quite regularly, and that will save you time not having to go to one menu, another menu, and so forth. There are some times that we would like to put some text over an image, and maybe I'm going to want to click here to see what the text looks like. Well, that's nice, but wouldn't it be nice if I could get a sample of what the font looks like before I even have to commit? If I use this pull down, you'll see I can see all these different fonts pretty big. Now, when you do this, if you haven't made this adjustment that I'm about to show you, it's very possible that yours might look a whole lot smaller. You might be having to pull up a magnifying glass to try and figure out, well, what does that font really look like? Here's what you need to do. So you go to Type, and you come to Font Preview Size. And here you get to preview how big you want the fonts to look. I choose either extra large or huge. And by doing that, you'll notice when I use this pull down, we can see what these fonts look like without having to go and put it into the composition and then resize it. So there's a quick shortcut right there for you to simply go to the Type and choose Font Preview Size. By the way this I think normally comes is small. And if I bring up a font now, look at this. Can you see that? Yeah, you can see a lot on the screen, but to me it's worthless. So this is why I like to go to type and font preview size and huge. And now when I use this pull down, I can see what the letters really look like. If you need to type in a given area, here's something you can do. If you click on the type tool, which is this T, and maybe I'll just go and click and hold and draw a box, just like that. What this is going to do is it's going to confine your type to just within that box. So no matter what you're typing, it won't go outside of that box. That can be really good if you're doing text on a picture where you only want the text to be over a certain portion of the image, but not over another area. Again, to do that, just simply click on the type tool and then click and hold and draw a box. And this lorem ipsum just gives you a sample of what the text is going to look like based upon the size of the font and which font you use. By the way, I can use the scrubbies up here and make these a whole lot smaller if I wanted. And again, that shows you what that's going to look like within that box. There are times when we're working with multiple files that we're saving that we would like to go and use this open recent. And you'll notice mine is set up to show me the last 20 images that I've worked on. Would you like to have more than 20 images? For me, if you were working on a calendar, for instance, I would think you'd at a minimum need 12. So this way you could go back and look at whichever month you wanted to look at without having to go and search for it. But if you wanted to have more than just this, there's a way that we can adjust that in the preferences. And if I go to edit and then come down here to preferences, now if you're using a Mac, this is going to be slightly different. You'll have to go to some button that's in the upper left-hand corner and then look for preferences. They do it a little bit differently. But once you've done this, then all you need to do is go into file handling, and down here in the bottom, you'll notice it says recent file list contains 20 files. You can change this to 25 or 30 or 50. Maybe you're working on a deck of cards, you might need 52. Point is, this is where that number comes from when you come up to the file and open recent. And you'll see I've only got 20 here. That's all I ever need. But this is a great place to come back to open up things that you've been working on recently. And this is also really important if you ever save something and maybe you didn't quite direct that save to the folder that you wanted it to go to. Well, now you can just go here and say open recent, and it will open that from wherever it is instantly. And the good thing there is, let's say if I were to click on this shortcuts, which is a file that I was talking about earlier. This is the shortcuts opening page that I made for Friday Night Photoshop. Now if I were to come up here and do a save as, this is going to show me where this was being saved to, in this case to my K drive, FNPS, and then to the 16th season. And that tells me where this actually came from. It's a neat little way to find out, okay, where did that really go? So if you weren't diligent enough to take care to know where that went. There are some right-click menu items that are worth noting. If I right-click up here on this rectangular marquee tool, you'll see that I've got different tools that I can use. But if I right-click on the image itself, you'll see that I've got duplicate layer, delete the layer. I've got different things that I can do on this image. If I come here to this quick selection tool and right click out here, you'll notice that I have different things. And if I come over here to the clone stamp tool and right click out here, I have different things here. I've got brushes now that I can change. and put up different ones. So I just want to call your attention to the fact that no matter which tool you might be working in, when you come over and right-click in the image, you'll find that there are different things that are brought up depending upon which tool you're working under. This is why I really like the rectangular marquee tool as being what I call my home tool, because these are functions that I use a lot, like the free transform and some of those. So let's talk about some preferences that we might want to go and set in Photoshop. Now, in a traditional PC, we're going to go to Edit, come down here to Preferences, and I'm going to start right here at the top in General. If you have a Mac, you're going to have to go to the upper left-hand corner, click on Photoshop, and then search for the Preferences, and you should get to a dialog box that looks very much the same as what you're seeing here. Now, I'm not going to go through everything here, but I do want to call your attention to a couple of things that I think are valuable and will help you save some time when you're working on images in Photoshop. So first of all, under General, there's not too much I'm going to change here. I'm just going to leave this one alone. Under Interface, pretty much the same thing. These are things that you could change. This is like the color theme for the background if you wanted it to be a little lighter or if you wanted it to be blacker. I'm content with the way this looks in the background, so I don't change that. Of course, I'm using English. That could be different if you're fluent in some other language, but for me, English works. Here's the user interface font size. I keep mine in small, but you could try experimenting and making that a little bigger if you ever had that need. So let's come down here to the workspace. Under workspace, I don't change much here. I just leave things alone. Under tools, this is where I will change some things, namely how my cursor works. I like using the zoom with the scroll wheel. I do this without even thinking about it now. If I need to make an image larger or smaller, see, I'm just turning the wheel on the mouse. And that's zoom with scroll wheel. Check that. You'll find that it's not. Zoom resizes windows. I want that. Zoom clicked point to center. That is a huge one because watch this. If I wanted to click on this PS and zoom in, you see I'm coming to the PS. But if I come down here and click in this, where it says 16th year, when I turn this, see how it's zooming in down in that corner. Or if I do it right in the middle, it zooms in the middle. This is great for being able to go and look at an image and to quickly zoom in just to an area that you want to go look at without having to move the image all around the screen. That's under Tools, and this is Zoom Clicked Point to Center. Okay, let's continue down this list. And again, some of these I'm just going to pretty much skip over. And by the way, if you want to, you can just hit Next, and that's going to take you down. So in this case, I'm not going to change anything in this particular one. File handling. This could be important for you. We can automatically save recovery information every 10 minutes, or we could change this to some other interval. That could be important if you're working on some critical documents and maybe you have a power outage and your UPS doesn't carry you on your computer. Although I will say, if you have a power outage and if you don't have a UPS, then you could have a bigger problem with your hard drive. So this may not be the end-all answer for that need. The rest of this, there's not a whole lot that I'm going to change. Next, export. I don't change anything here. Performance. This is an important one. You know, when I do that Control Z to step back, well, here's how you can dictate how many steps back you can take. I've got mine set to 50. So I could do an undo 50 times. You may never need that many. Just know that whatever the higher the number is, the more memory that the system's going to be taking because it's trying to remember 50 steps ago. Cache levels, the key to this, set it to 4 if it isn't already, and don't change it. There are ways that you can adjust this, but Adobe tells you set it to 4, don't ask any questions. Leave it at 4. If you go higher or lower, you'll find that you might have some system issues whereby your screen may not look right. I'll just leave it at that. The next one is, how much RAM do you want Photoshop to use? Well, the available RAM in my 32 gig system right now is only 25 gigs. So they're recommending the ideal range to be between 13 and basically 18. Now, for Photoshop, you really want to have a minimum of 16 gigs of RAM in your system. That's something that you might want to go and consider upgrading your RAM. If you have more than that, then that's always a good thing. I've got 32. Do I wish I had 64? Yeah, sometimes, but I'm content with 32. So far, I haven't needed more than 32. You know what I say, so far. And I've worked on some rather large pieces of artwork, and it's worked fine for me. But I wasn't running 4 or 5 other things at that same time either. I knew that I was going to be needing a lot of RAM for the images with which I was working. So, general consensus 32 gigs is pretty good to have in your computer. If you can't get that, at least have 16. And if you have less than 16, now would be a good time to think about going out and buying some RAM. And this is where you can set how much RAM Photoshop is going to use. And it's just a matter of moving this little slider back and forth. And this is telling you what the ideal range is. I'm going to step down a couple more here. Image processing, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about. Scratch disks, occasionally you hear some people say that they get an error saying that their scratch disk is full. This is where you get to point the scratch disk to some hard drive in your system that if you don't have enough RAM, then Photoshop uses the disk as its temporary workspace. And it's not the best, it slows things down. But in this case, I just have it pointed to the C drive. It's going to consume very little space because, again, I've got 32 gigs of RAM. If I didn't have enough RAM, again, Photoshop's going to be looking for more counter space, if you will, to make the meal. And so that's going to be borrowing some from your hard drive. It's not efficient when that happens. So again, go get more RAM. Cursors is one of those areas that it's really important to make a couple of changes here right out of the gate. First of all, I like to see the full-size brush tip. Who wouldn't? I don't know. When this comes, they give you this little paintbrush. I like to see how big is that brush tip. And by the way, do you want the crosshair in the center of the brush tip? I do, because when I'm using the clone stamp tool, sometimes I want to be very precise about where I'm sourcing so that I know exactly where I'm going to be pasting. So I click this little show crosshair, and I like that. Other cursors, I don't know about you, I've never liked the eyedropper. I'd much rather have the precise one. And the brush preview, red's okay. It doesn't bother me because I'm never going to see that. Transparencies and gamut, I don't touch anything here. We know that anytime we see this checkerboard, that it's transparent. Think of a picture frame that doesn't even have glass in it. That's how transparent it is. Units and rulers, well, in this country we use points, but mostly we use inches. If we were doing something for overseas, we might want to go to millimeters or centimeters, possibly for Canada. I think they're on the metric system. But for what we're mostly doing is inches. But just know that you can change that if you start doing international work. For the guides and grids and slices, here are the marching ants. There's just some of these things that we just don't need to touch. They're fine. Plugins, I don't even touch this. I use plugins that don't even involve this, so we're not going to go there. Type, how many recent fonts do you want to display? 10's a pretty nice number. That's just like how many images have you recently opened up? Well, this is really nice because this will show you the last 10 fonts that you've worked with. And if you're doing some work where you might have 2 or 3 fonts that you're forever using, why have to go up and down the list to find them all the time? This puts them right up at the top, and it's the top 10. and it's really nice. If you need this to be more, make it 15, make it 20, whatever you want to make it. This is where you make it, right there. 3D I don't do a whole lot with. If you folks are working with 3D, you could probably show me something about this, but I don't do anything with 3D. Technology previews, again, I don't touch this. And then product information, this just tells you a little bit. If you'd like to do product improvements, they do actually have a method here that you can participate in this, and they will look at some of the stuff that you're doing. It tells you right there what it's going to collect, and they will be in touch with you. Now, there was one thing I wanted to show you here. I'm going to go back to this performance because there's one more thing I'd like to show you here. Graphics processor settings. If you're using an older graphics processor, which unfortunately I am now, well, sometimes you might run into a situation where Photoshop won't do something, or it will balk and it will just stop, and it'll say, okay, we're disabling the graphics processor and we're going to let your main CPU do all this work. Well, that's not as efficient. It's much better to hand off graphics processing needs to a graphics processor. But if you're running into situations where maybe your Adobe is shutting down or you're having some issues, go in here and shut off this graphics processor first and see if things just don't run smoother. It could mean that you need to go and get an update for your graphics processing card, for your GPU. And a lot of times you do have to go get that update if you haven't done it in like the last 6 months. A lot of these different brands have updates, some are even every other month. So if you haven't looked for that lately, it's worth going and finding out which graphics processor you have in your system. Go to that manufacturer's website, put in your processor number, and see if you're up to date. It's very possible you may not be if you haven't done this in like the last 6 months. So that's worth doing. And this is where, again, you can run into some issues if your processor isn't updated and or if it's an older one. And a quick way to resolve some of these is to shut off this use graphics processor. I should probably just talk about one more here. I don't like auto showing the home screen or use the legacy new document interface. I shut everything off in this first list. For me, it's very confusing to first open up Photoshop and not see a blank palette. I don't want to see stuff that I've been working on already. Again, it's a personal preference, but that's just something that I don't like to deal with. And to me, I just shut those all off. So there are the preferences that I use in Photoshop that speed up the process for me. So folks, there are some shortcuts and some time savers in Photoshop, and also some things that I do in the preferences menu to make my Photoshop operate a little bit faster for me. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again on another Friday Night Photoshop.